Okay, boys and girls, brothers and sisters, this is the other Paul. We are finally here. After numerous delays of multiple minutes, because all the content had been done. Okay, all my notes, all my stuff I wanted to say and present, it's all been done. The problem was the slides. All right, those were not done. So I was kind of having to do a good speed run just to assemble all the slides. But thankfully, because the content had been done, it wasn't as much of a delay as it otherwise could have been. And now, unfortunately, I still see people trying to give me crap for all this. You are like a false prophet of the apocalypse, always putting dates that don't fulfill. Shiver me timbers, shiver me timbers. All right. The other false prophet. Come on now. Come on, guys. Really? Well, well, there's been a memorable argument from silence. That's right. That was the whole point of this, actually. That was my entire argument, to not say anything. And that made my case for me right there, you guys. I hope you've been impressed by the content. Like, subscribe, send me money, etc. Good morning, King. Good morning to you, Samuel. I see you're excited, Jeremiah, and likewise you, Mr. Skyscraper Philosopher. Yeah. Whatever, Dr. Bob. Whatever, mate. Well, I sent you an email we talked about. I think you got busy, but I just want to say, yeah, there's a few emails I need to get back to, and I will be, so do not fret, friends. Have I posted this on Twitter? Yes, I have. Excellent. Paul coming in late to the exam, 15 minutes late to the exam because he's reviewing something real. Argument from absence, followed by argument from patience. That's true. I hope you guys are... I hope you guys are very well versed in the argument from patience. This was actually the test today. So, yes, there you go. His presentation is under doctrinal review. That's right. That's true. I did my own actual doctrinal review of my essay. I am my own standard. Fun fact. Argument from silence, gang represent. That's right. Not to be confused with the crappy skeptic version of the argument from silence, which I'm going to be eviscerating today as well, because I'm distinguishing the good kind from the crappy kind. Can your so-called argument from silence defeat the Newman-based doctrine of fideism? God willing, I do hope so. That is my intention. So, unfortunately, I didn't get time to make tea, which sucks. It sucks a lot. So I'm kind of tempted right now. I know you guys have already waited a little bit, but look, you guys know me. I really bloody want my tea. And oh dear, I forgot to put on. What is this? Sacre bleu. I forgot to put this on. What am I doing, man? What am I doing? Because of course I have this cross thing, and because I merely have this cross image of Christ, I'm an iconodual. According to Craig Trulier. Yes. Oh man. Okay, not gonna lie, guys. I kind of want my tea, so I'm kind of toying with the idea of just another really quick pause while I get my tea. But you know what I can do? I have a solution for that. So you guys aren't just being bored out of your tears. What I can do is pull up a clip from my highlights channel and play that. Play that whilst we're waiting. But yeah, and otherwise, because yes, I do need my tea. Otherwise, though, after this, I'm gonna put something in the description or even the title or wherever, just so people know where to skip to, because there's a lot of there's a lot of fluff here. So what I will do is load up consequences of iconoduality. I have so many good clips, not gonna lie. I'll load up this clip. From me and River. In the spirit of all the recent discussions and arguments and mudslinging regarding icons and all that stuff, I'm going to play a clip that from the interview discussion I had with River. What up, Paul? Whatever, dog. How are you, man? Love the false dichotomy between full-blown iconodulia and full-on lack of imagery at all. Very entertaining. Oh, yeah, indeed. Can I be the other Jeremiah? I mean, no one's claimed it, so hey, go ahead. All right, people, so here's our interlude. I'm going to play this while I go get my tea, and I'll probably get back before it's done. But yeah, enjoy it. Have fun.
Guys, this is quite obviously what happens with images. Okay, so let's take Mary, for instance. She was a Middle Eastern poor girl, like 13 years old, when she was pregnant with our Lord, right? And how does she get depicted? Absolutely stunningly gorgeous, the fairest white skin you could imagine, luscious blonde hair, a halo above her head, wearing silk clothes of blue and white. Like, that's what's going on, right? And this is, it's saying that when you do that, you basically are just inciting or enticing people to worship it. And you can't tell us that's not what we see in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox world. I've seen people lying prostrate before images of Mary, before statues of her. And I look at the statue and I'm sort of thinking, I highly doubt Mary looked like that statue, for starters. And it's just, this is what happens. I went on a mission trip to India. It was quite a few years ago now. I think it was in 2017. And the part of India we're in, there was lots of Roman Catholics, and man, the image worship was unlike anything I've ever seen before. I mean, obviously the Hindus would do it too to their demon gods, but the Catholics as well would. It would almost be kind of funny. So you'd have this representation of some demon on one side of the street for the Hindu demons, and then on the other side of the road, like it would often happen this way, you'd have boom, a statue of a Catholic saint, and the same sort of veneration the Hindus would show to their demon images, the Catholics would show to the statues of the saints, but it would always be depicted, you know, in stunning form, right? Yeah. I just
it is a funny observation. It really is a funny observation, and I think the abuse just somehow goes even further, because sometimes they'll even say, "Oh, we're not trying to do this. We don't want to do that." But then they do that anyway. And a good example, I'm Sean Barser here with this comment reminded me of it. I can understand venerating images of Christ. Well, hopefully after this, you can understand not doing that now, because as the logic of Scripture itself says, this is the immortal God, and you're putting him in a corruptible form. Don't do that.
And thank you for the correction, James. Yes.
Nonetheless, yes, Romanists, not Catholics. Yep, 100%. That's in my head. Nonetheless, in terms of a relative hierarchy of sensibility, sure, let's say venerating images of Christ, that's the least objectionable of otherwise a set of objectionable stuff. They tend to lose me when Catholics say you can venerate images of saints and angels as well as images of God the Father. That last one is the one that really tells me, especially with Orthodoxy, because you can find a good deal of images of God the Father himself. And yet when you look at their own principles as throughout their own writings, including Nicaea 2 itself, that is absolutely forbidden, because they will themselves, particularly John of Damascus, he will strongly emphasize how, oh, look, Israel, they didn't see God because he was God the Father. No one has seen him. That's why they couldn't depict him, which is a misinterpretation of that Deuteronomy passage, but whatever. And then he says, but now with Christ becoming incarnate, he became in flesh, he became in material. Therefore, we can depict him, and we really should, and give veneration to it. But then we can say, okay, cool, let's grant that silliness. God the Father, you still haven't seen him. No one has seen the Father and lived. They grant that. They actually grant that. Nicaea 2 itself, in their Acts, say that no one has seen the Father and lived. And that's why, in addition, they'll actually try to argue, and we'll get into that. They'll try to argue that in making images of Christ, they're only depicting his human nature and not his divine nature, which is like, Nestorian alert. But either way, they're deliberately trying to say we're not trying to depict the divine nature, let alone the Father, right? And yet you will see today icons of the Father, not just little images.
Yeah, that's true. That was a good point of the discussion. That was some good stuff. Oh, hey. No way. Sam, good to see you here. Good to see you. By the way, A, don't dox us. B, whatchamacallit. That was just a clip I was playing because I was getting my tea, so I wanted to keep the masses entertained while I was doing that. All right, so no more dilly-dallying. So it's around the 18-minute mark, so that means I'm going to have to I'm going to put down that time after the fact in the description or comments or something, whatever. Basically tell people to skip to that because there's way too much delay. Way too much. Hey, Arjun, good to see you, King. Good to see you. Polio looks so much younger. How? What? That doesn't make sense. No way. That's not. No. Plot twist. I didn't know he was showing a video of himself. Tea break full. real. All right. Okay. What kind of tea are you drinking? Assam Bold from Twinings. It's good stuff. It's one of my favorites. The filthy one among the masses was most entertaining. Good clip. All right. No more dilly-dallying, ladies and gentlemen. We shall jump right into it. This is a presentation defining and defending the argument from silence. That is its use in history, in historical study, etc. So I have that up. Let me just divide my windows. So I have this on one side and my notes on the other. Okay, so I think this is all ready. And as far as I know, even though it was really quickly put together, my slides are complete. There shouldn't be typos or like placeholder stuff that I had there before. It should be all good and ready to go. Okay, so let us begin. But before we begin, here's the lesson structure. So we're going to be going over the definition of the argument, the criteria, that is the good criteria that I will propose from it, which I'm drawing from other authors. And then in section 3, that'll be a pretty short one, but they'll just be going over some examples of bad arguments from silence. Number 4, we'll be responding to the key criticisms of the arguments from silence. It's really just 2 main criticisms, but if anyone has any others, they can drop them in the chat and I can answer them in Q&A. And then number 5 is going to be two case study examples, one hypothetical and one real example, where I believe the argument from silence works extremely well and establishes the non-existence of something with moral certainty, given the data that we have in hand applied to the criteria. But now, anyway, before that, my plug for support. As I mentioned quite a bit, supporters of all tiers do receive priority in Q&A, whether I open up questions in between major sections. Maybe I will do that this lecture or not. Maybe there'll be points later on where I'll say, okay, let's take some questions before we move on. And if that does happen, then I will prioritize Subscribe Star supporters, but also Super Chats, but I more so encourage Subscribe Star. So yes, your questions both in the middle and at the end of this lesson will be prioritized if you are a supporter of any tier as low as $4.50 US a month. And likewise, supporters of all tiers, this is a new reward. Supporters of all tiers will receive full lecture notes via Subscribe Star and maybe through the Discord as well. But the Subscribe Star will be the main thing, so everybody can access it. And again, this is bringing back regular lesson streams. These are going to be at least once per fortnight. And so they'll be in the same format with slides and all that. And I'll prepare very copious notes for all of them. And those notes will be released for supporters of all tiers after the lesson. So you can become a supporter of any tier to get those benefits, but also get other really awesome benefits if at higher tiers if you go over to Subscribe Star. And all my current supporters, I thank you a lot. Thank you so much for your support. Anyway, right into it. So here's a basic definition of the argument from silence, which I get from a writer of my personal favorite book on historical method. Is my personal Bible for it, called A Guide to Historical Method, which is actually written in the mid-40s. So it's pretty darn early. And this is the 4th printing of that book, which is from like the mid-50s. So very, very old. But it's a gem. It's an absolute gem in what it does. So the definition he proposed, which we'll be working off today, and I believe no controversy about this, is a pretty simple thing. The argument from silence aims to prove the non-reality of an alleged fact from the circumstance that contemporary or later sources of that information fail to say anything about it. It is sometimes misleadingly called the negative argument, but this can easily be taken to mean something false, namely that the argument rests on an explicit denial of some fact. A writer's silence regarding a fact may be because of ignorance or by deliberate omission or from lapse of memory. So, nice and standard definition, and also some cautions in how to use it right away. He also defines the 2 main uses of the argument from silence. the argument from silence may serve two ends. It may establish the non-reality of a supposed fact when all contemporary or quasi-contemporary sources fail to record it, or it may prove the untrustworthiness of a witness who testifies to a supposed fact when other contemporary or quasi-contemporary witnesses are silent about it. In such cases, the silence of even one important witness may be tantamount to proof. So those are the two main uses right there. But I will be primarily focused on the first use of the argument from silence. That is the disproving of, well, demonstrating the non-reality of something. The other use of demonstrating unreliability of witnesses, distinct one. I won't be covering over that, but similar to the same principles can be applied to that. Now, it is also necessary to distinguish between two kinds of the argument. One of them is this, which I'll call the silence of sources, that is the simple lack of attesting sources, versus silence within a source, i.e. within a specific source and its context. So the former, where someone says, oh, well, this thing is clearly not real, or this document is not authentic because there's no contemporary sources, that attest to it, or that all contemporary sources fail to attest to it, versus the latter kind, where it's more specific, that we have this source and it is discussing a context wherein we ought to expect, if this thing were true, it to be mentioned. And so, because it doesn't mention it, we therefore have a significant silence that demonstrates something's non-reality. The latter kind of silence is much more workable, much more precise. It has stronger standards. It's much more rigorous. And so it has much more powerful potential if the data allows for it to be used. The former kind is orders of magnitude more precarious than the latter, especially when the investigation itself actually stretches back into antiquity, because from antiquity, the vast majority of our literary sources are totally lost. You can see this just by reading Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, Photius of Constantinople's Myria Biblion, where he literally lists 200 plus books with little synopses, and a massive portion of them we just don't have at all today. As well as another kind of niche example, I guess, but the Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, a pagan author from the early 3rd century, I believe. And he lists tons and tons of sources regarding the succession of the various philosophical schools and their main teachers, sources which we just do not have today at all. Oh, legend. Thank you so much, Herschel. You're an absolute legend. Massively appreciate it. Massively appreciate it. Subscribe, people, to Subscribestar. But yes, anyway, there are lots of sources in antiquity which we do not have in our possession. And so that kind of argument from the mere lack of attesting sources for something is much, much weaker, borderline impossible to make in the vast majority of circumstances. Whereas closer to modern times, especially by the time of the British Empire, where somebody farts and they make a document about it, that's a much more feasible argument to make. But even then, still need to be careful, still need to be quite careful. Nonetheless, the key argument from silence I'll be defending is the much more specific kind of argument from silence, wherein a silence within a source, where it is given the context of what that source is saying, it is expected that it would mention the idea in question, but it doesn't. So that's the key one I'll be looking at. That. The paper that I've mentioned by Tim McGrew, and I'll be citing it in just a second for his criteria, he primarily responds to that more general kind of argument from silence and the lack of sources, which is why in his criteria, he includes a criterion that for the argument to work, it must be demonstrated that the source would have survived up to our time, which I presume he'd think this, and I'd definitely agree if he does, that is borderline impossible to argue with respect to antiquity, and even in certain circumstances, the Middle Ages. But either way, moving on to criteria. Okay, so again, as mentioned, there's a distinction between a lack of sources attesting to something versus silence within a source. It is the latter which I am defending as a solid argument from silence. I'm not denying that the former argument can work. It's just more precarious, and I'm not as interested in defending it. So certain, and it's important to make this distinction because certain arguments against the general argument from silence only work against the former one. So I mentioned, for example, how with respect to antiquity, many sources are completely lost to us. And that's just going off the sources that we know of by mention. God knows how many sources we do not have in our possession, which were never mentioned, or at least no mention of them survives today. God knows. And so for that argument, with respect to antiquity, it's quite decisive in 99.99999% of circumstances, I believe. However, that kind of an argument does not work against the argument from silence I'm referring to, because I will be referring to a silence within a source, as I've mentioned quite a bit before. Now, we can look now at the same author from before, Gilbert Garrigan. And by the way, fun fact, he's actually a Jesuit priest. So my favorite work on historical method, my key one that I use, written by a Jesuit. How funny is that? He's genuinely great, though. He's genuinely fantastic at what he does. But he lays out the criteria as follows. To be valid, the argument from silence must fulfill two conditions. The writer whose silence is invoked in proof of the non-reality of an alleged fact would certainly have known about it had it been a fact. Second, knowing it, he would, under the circumstances, certainly have made mention of it. When these two conditions are fulfilled, the argument from silence proves its point with moral certainty. Both conditions have their explanation in the human instincts, which urge us to ascertain the truth, as also to give expression to it when self-interest so requires. And so to note on moral certainty refers to how he himself defines it in the work as the convergence of all probabilities towards one thing, that there is no other reasonable explanation for the data, that all the probabilities point one way. And so while it's technically possible that one could theorize another hypothesis, it's simply not reasonable. There is no reason to prefer that over this other thing, and all the probabilities otherwise very strongly point towards the one conclusion. And so that's what's referred to by moral certainty, that there's just no other reasonable explanation, basically. Now, he did a little bit so at the end of this quote here, but he also gives the key presuppositions under this, which is really, really cool, because even if you're not a presupp apologist, I'm personally friendly to it, but not fully one myself. I haven't fully read about it. We can all recognize that presuppositions are, well, definitionally fundamental to everything we do in thinking and all these kinds of intellectual endeavors. And so what's super good is that Garrigan actually lists out his presuppositions here, which is fantastic. Now, he says, in applying the argument from silence, the first step is to determine by rigorous analysis of the evidence whether or not the conditions laid down really exist. The first condition presupposes that the alleged fact was of some importance, was easily knowable, and would certainly have come directly or indirectly to the notice of the informant whose silence regarding it is under examination. So, that's necessary to establish. The second condition presupposes, and this is the most important one for the argument from silence, presupposes that suppression of the fact would have been prejudicial to the informant by compromising his reputation for honor, justice, patriotism, learning, by injuring his family, political party, religious denomination, or by giving comfort and aid to his enemies. And I think there's a number of other examples of such he could list that he doesn't. Like there's countless other situations that would just preclude someone from not mentioning something, all else being equal, even if they're lesser things, just like the simple desire to give a complete account of something when asked. So one example I give is someone is making a list of all baseball players in a team. Someone's making a list of baseball players in a team that they're looking at. And so that person, and they do have access to know who is in the team. Okay, so to all the players in the team. Now, a person on that goal is predisposed to listing every single player, and he will not arbitrarily leave one out. And so if he does leave out a name, absent any other mitigating circumstances, like a player holding a gun to his head and telling him not to list him, absent any of those other mitigating circumstances, all else being equal, if the guy leaves out a name, it is because he does not know that the player is in that team, or perhaps actually knows that the player is not in the team. Therefore, we can discern from that silence that the player is not within that team. assuming the reliability of that source. So that's the nature of the second presupposition. It's really a key one, and it really is just rooted in common human experience, I believe. I don't agree that presuppositions are fundamental to everything. It seems that direct acquaintance is fundamental. I'm not sure there's an opposition there, because there's distinctions. I'm referring to like when we're doing intellectual endeavors and argumentation, and that our presuppositions are everything. Even the intelligibility of our experience is a presupposition. But that's not to say, when I say something's a presupposition, that, oh, well, it's an unproven thing, you're uncertain about it, blah, blah, blah. That's bullcrap when someone says that. I believe that, yes, the intelligibility of our human experience, that is a necessary presupposition. You cannot challenge that. You just can't rationally challenge it. So yeah, I disagree with that framing. That was a good analogy, very relatable. Thank you very much. Now, we will now move on to, oh yeah. So this is basically what I said before, but I guess I'll just make it clear. There are situations in which one would make mention of an idea had one known or believed it. And this is a core presupposition that validates the argument from silence in principle. Again, it depends on the specific case we're looking at, the data available, whether we can actually determine that. But otherwise, in principle, this presupposition does validate the argument from silence. And this presupposition is validated, I will very blatantly say, by common human experience, that there are scenarios in which, all else being equal, we would make mention of an idea in a certain context, or that someone we know or converse with would do the same had we or they known or believed that idea. And again, this is not a denial of the possibility of mitigating circumstances, but it establishes a general norm. Absent reasonable mitigating circumstances, this norm can be appealed to if validated by the nature of the context. So if there's an expectation, a reasonable expectation, if not a certain expectation, that someone would make mention of something in the context of a discourse and they don't mention it, if we cannot see any likely mitigating circumstances, we can thus reasonably conclude that the silence entails the person's lack of knowledge or belief in something. And the reverse happens as well for positive human testimony, because just as someone can always propose, oh, well, the person might have mentioned it because they could have been attacked by an alien, and the alien tells them not to mention the thing despite them having every reason to mention it or whatever. You could do the same thing with positive evidence, and hyperskeptics and positive and like hardcore deductivists do that with positive historical evidence. Like, oh, well, because if we point to the positive testimony of a primary source for an event or a fact, they could always say, oh, well, they could have been mistaken. They could have seen things. They could have made it up. Just constant could, which is bloody useless. Unless that is actually demonstrated as a real possibility or probability, there's no reason to grant that. And so the positive evidence, which I would argue the silence in a way is a positive evidence, will come out on top. Now, on to Tim McGrew's criteria. This is where his paper mostly comes in. And I'll comment on a few things, especially one kind of funny thing. He says, anyone who puts forward an argument from silence in historical inquiry should offer explicit arguments for each of the three claims corresponding to the three terms in the critical product. And note something here. These criteria of his, they come at the conclusion of his paper. So he gives them out in more detail and explains the problems surrounding uses of the argument and gives a case study or two. So this is in the conclusion of his paper where he summarizes the criteria. Should offer explicit arguments for each of the three claims corresponding to the three terms in the critical product. Should offer, that is to say, separate arguments that, one, the event or fact would almost certainly have come to the notice of the author or authors in question. And notice he gives a bunch of Bayesian formulae here. That's actually a focus of his paper, to put this in Bayesian terms. And oh boy, Mr. Bayes is making a return. Mr. Bayes is back, boy. Oh dear. Anybody familiar enough with certain events that I've engaged in will know why it's funny. Anyway, so if notice that first criteria more or less corresponds directly with Garrigan's. Criteria 2, the author or authors would have recorded it or in some other clear fashion given evidence of the fact had they noticed it. And this largely coincides with Garrigan's second criteria as well. But McGrew also gives a third criteria, as I mentioned earlier. And third, the work or works in which this was done would have survived to the present era and come to the notice of contemporary scholars. Exact numbers are, of course, unnecessary, but as we have seen, the standards to which such arguments must be held is very high. For if at any of these 3 points a cogent argument cannot be made, the argument from silence, whatever its superficial attractions, will be weaker than almost any other kind of historical evidence. So that's what he says there. And if we notice, there is major, almost identical overlap between criteria 1 and 2 from Garrigan and McGrew. But I believe the key difference is in the context of their arguments, because whereas McGrew's criteria are aimed primarily at the appeal to the silence of any sources itself, Garrigan more explicitly focuses in on the criteria of looking for silence within an author, where an author should have mentioned it in a given text. So key difference. McGrew, the silence, the mere existence of silence at all, the evidential power of such, versus Garrigan, and subsequently also my argument, silence within a given context. So that's the difference. This is the meaningful so meaningful silence is silence in a context where silence is unexpected, and conversely where the idea in question is expected to be mentioned. That's the kind I'm going for. McGrew has rather high standards for the argument from silence than I generally see on YouTube. Oh, 100%, 100%. And rightly so, because a lot of people make that kind of argument from silence, of just mere silence, like a mere lack of mention in any sources, and they just don't appreciate how ridiculously high of a bar they have to reach with that, especially for ancient history. But yeah, otherwise his criteria are more meant for that. He does somewhat, I think, address, from memory, he does somewhat address the idea of the expectation within a given work for an author to mention something, but otherwise that's not really his focus. And Garrigan and other guys I'm about to mention as well, more focus on that second one. As Samuel here says, important distinction. It is that second argument which I'll be defending, because it's much more precise. Now, the distinction between mere versus contextual silence is actually made clear by some other authors. And I don't know if it's French, I cannot for the life of me pronounce this. Like, what was it, Langlois and Saint-Gobain or something like that? I have no idea how to pronounce these. So I'm just going to ossify their names and just call them Lango and Sango. So Lango and Sango say in their own work, which is actually from before Garrigan, Introduction to the Study of History, they actually make the exact same distinction. I was actually really happy to find this because I had noted this distinction. I deduced this distinction between those two kinds of silences beforehand, before I'd ever seen their source. And when I found them, I was very happy to actually kind of see I'm tracking along with more learned guys. So they say, before we argue from silence, we should ask, might not this fact have failed to be recorded in any of the documents we possess? That which is conclusive is not the absence of any document on a given fact, but silence as to the fact in a document in which it would naturally be mentioned. That's the key right there. Put a pin in that. That is the crème de la crème of arguments from silence. That is the good kind. Very specific criteria can be applied. There's actually an expectation for data. That is the key right there. That is the big, big, big key. Now, they likewise, right after this section in their book, which can actually be found on Project Gutenberg, great site for finding old text. So just look up their work, Project Gutenberg, you can find it, and look at the section I cited there, chapter 3, section 2. And just after this quoted area, they actually they outline their criteria for a conclusive argument from silence. And this is actually summarized in another paper, also called The Argument from Silence. So not to be confused with Tim's paper, The Argument from Silence, but another paper by a certain John Lane from 1966. He actually summarizes their argument neatly in these 4 propositions. So first, there is an authentic document, D, or a functional equivalent thereof, which is extent in which the event, E, is not mentioned. 2, it was the intention of the author of D to enumerate exhaustively all the members of the class of events of which E is supposed to be a member. 3, The author of D was acquainted with all members of the class in question. 4. E must be such that if it had occurred, the author of D could not have overlooked it. Now, Lane gives some like critiques of the criteria, just in terms of like whether criteria number 3 is necessary, for example, given that 4 and 2 kind of say a similar thing. But I think it's good that there's a nice and very precise outlining of the criteria. So I think it works either way. So the important thing to note is that Lango and Sango they don't claim that it's strictly necessary. From what I've read, they do not claim it's strictly necessary for a successful argument from silence to fulfill all of these conditions. Just that these are the conditions for a conclusive argument from silence. Like, yes, we got certainty. This is meaningful silence. This is good. This is real. Now, we can make yet another distinction. Look out, Christian Wagner. I'm about to make more distinctions than you. Someone call him. It's possible to further distinguish between silence indicating the lack of an author's knowledge of or belief in an idea versus that silence evidencing the non-reality of an idea. So, 2 examples of this. One, one can demonstrate via silence that an author from the 21st century does not know that Mount Vesuvius exploded in the 1st century AD. But this does not therefore demonstrate that Vesuvius did not erupt in the 1st century AD, because this person is literally 2,000 years separated, utterly irrelevant, not a primary source. They are not in a position where it's expected that they would know of it if it was true. Not at all. Now, example B, a more relevant one for stuff I engage in. Via silence, it is shown, hypothetically, that a father from the 8th century does not believe that Esther is canonical scripture. This does not itself prove that Esther is not canonical, because those are discussions and issues where there's even secondary sources that go well before this guy. So this person is not a father from the 8th century is not in such a position where, had Esther been canonical, they would necessarily know it, because that's not true at all. There's lots of canonical discussions. There was diversity on opinions of the canon centuries before an 8th century father. They are not a primary source. They are not a primary source privy to the writing and inspiration directly of the Book of Esther. So their opinion on that, even if you demonstrate via silence that they themselves don't believe it, or know it, it doesn't therefore mean that this indicates Esther really is not canonical. So those 2 things do need to be distinguished, and that's more or less what the two main criteria given by Garrigan and also by McGrew, and in a way also by the other guys. That distinction is implicitly noted by those criteria. So had they known it, they would have certainly mentioned it. Known it or believed it, they would have mentioned it in a context. But then also, this is distinct from whether they were actually in a position to know something necessarily had it been true. Bro, until you distinguish different types of distinctions that are used for various distinctions, you are not distinguishing properly. That's true. I forgot to tell Christian Wagner, I'm sorry. I forgot to sub-distinguish the minor premise. I'm running out of noose juice. I need to, excuse me while I get some more noose juice. Anyway, so to conclude, to derive non-reality, the non-reality of an idea from the ignorance of such an author, from the demonstrable ignorance of an author, it must be shown that the author was in a position to know the idea had it been true. So, the first criteria from Garrigan. Okay. If it decides to move, there we go. So, this is, given what I've drawn from these guys, my own thinking about the topic, this is the argument from silence as I have formulated it in kind of like a qualitative statement. So it goes as follows, how I formulate the argument from silence. There's an assertion that an historical event X occurred, or that X is true, or what have you. It's umbrella for any historical claim, alleged fact. So here's the analysis. There was an historical figure, let's call him Titus, who was in a position to have known X. However, when we see a document of his, Y, in which the context of the discourse, Z, creates an expectation for X to be mentioned, it does not appear. Given that Titus would make mention of X in context Z, since it was known by him, expected in the discourse, and the author is honest and competent, we can conclude by the absence of X in Y with moral certainty that the author did not believe or know X. And then further, since the author would have known X had it been true, X is therefore not true. Now, this is subject to tweaks and revisions here and there because this is all, relatively speaking, recent study and recent formulations. But otherwise, I believe this is very well solid. Maybe the beginning bit can be more precise. I should say in the beginning what I say at the end, that had X been true, Titus would have known it. So I can be a bit more precise. Either way. And to note as well, this can be modified for other forms of communication, other kinds of sources like speech or braille or whatever, any other kind of communication. So that's my formulation of the proper argument from silence. It is specific. It is contextually based. It is not a bare naked assumption that an author would say something or that there would be data for something if it's true. It is precise. It is establishing that there is an expectation for something had it been true, which does need to be justified, by the way, and hence the whole process. And once there is an expectation established, we can then test that where in places where the expectation can be, where the expectation is itself well expected in a way. And so when that is lacking, then we can actually say with confidence that the author does not know of the idea. Now, there is another bonus criterion, which I don't take as integral to the argument, but it's a bonus one where if it's actually fulfilled, it can make it even more powerful. And this is one I got actually from Dr. David A. Falk. Do pray for him, by the way, because the cancel mob trying to destroy him right now. And this is from our interview discussion, History, Archaeology, and Egypt 101, an interview with Dr. David A. Falk. You can find it on my channel. He argues, we see differently on this issue. He doesn't like the argument from silence, period, at least as it is. He seems to take it as a necessary criteria. I don't, but I do think it's a useful criteria. He says that silence becomes meaningful. There's a bit of a typo there. Silence becomes meaningful when another idea of the same kind is given in a source in place of the one in question. That is, the author fails to mention X where X is expected, but he does mention X too. So, as I say, I don't think this is strictly necessary. I think that one can have an expectation for data for something to be mentioned, even if there's not an equivalent kind mentioned. And so it's not integral to the argument, but it is a very helpful bonus, which greatly increases the power of an argument from silence. But also, with that being said, I did spend quite a bit of time trying to conceptualize this, whether this really does even need to be said as a separate criterion, or if this is just a necessary. I've genuinely considered, and I guess I still kind of am. So these aren't my absolute final thoughts on the issue. There's still some details, and this is one of them. It's possible, I've reckoned with it, that this criteria isn't really even a separate criteria, but just will, it's possible that this just will necessarily follow in a good argument from silence. This is very much possible because the key examples I use do, as far as I see, they almost always tend to include this. So that's something I'm still kind of visiting. But otherwise, nonetheless, good criteria to have on board. Although, as of right now, I don't think it's strictly necessary. Now, we can now take my formulation and I put it into a series of questions so that this can be readily employed in use of a historical investigation. So if anyone does like how I formulate the argument, they think it's useful, or even if you want to modify it somehow, this is a ready-made tool for that I've made myself. And again, still a young guy, lots of reading still to do, so things could change. But I've done a bunch of reading and a bunch of thinking on this right now. And so this is how I would formulate my argument from silence in a series of questions, which I can then apply to historical sources. So question 1, would the author have known about X? And I forgot to add after that, had X been true? And so that needs to be established. That has to be established. Question 2, is there any instance in the author's literary output wherein a mention of X is expected? And why is expected? Why is it expected? You have to justify that. And that right there is easily the most important. Well, I guess alongside question 1, but otherwise, at least with respect to the author's own knowledge, it is the most important criteria to establish by far. That's the central one. is there actually an expectation for data? If there isn't, nothing else matters. Does not matter at all. Arguably, unless there's a crazy circumstance in which another argument from silence can work. Anyway, excuse me, I'm getting a bit fruity. Now, question 2b, and this is where the bonus criterion comes in. Is another idea or ideas of the same kind proposed? Question 3, is the author honest? And I believe for good historical method, the assumption needs to be yes. Well, once you determine the genre, if the genre is like prose, nonfiction, giving statements of facts, and not like fiction or poetry or whatever, or fictional poetry that is. But given that genre, that the author is trying to make statements of fact, it is a necessary assumption that the authors are being honest unless demonstrated otherwise, innocent till proven guilty. A necessary presupposition. Otherwise, we have virtually no historical knowledge if we can default with skepticism. Sorry, YouTube skeptics against Christianity, but that's true. And even this can be validated by human experience. Generally speaking, in our day-to-day lives, and even in written texts of various kinds, authors by default are honest. That doesn't necessarily mean right or correct, but honest. That's just a general norm we should take for granted until there is countervailing evidence. And countervailing evidence doesn't have to be something that's like super hard and concrete per se, but that's another topic. Either way, the assumption should be yes for the author's honesty. But you can also add additional evidence that further demonstrates and further bolsters an author's honesty. Question 4, is the author competent? And bit of a vague, wide-ranging question, but more or less like, does the author know what they're doing? Is the author being attentive to their work? Is the author including everything they need to do? So one example could be like that, where this could fail is if you can demonstrate that the author is actually being quite forgetful in his text. And so if that is the case, then that could create a mitigating circumstance in which, in which it's possible, one could reasonably suppose that maybe the author just forgot to mention something which they otherwise did know or believe. That's quite rare, though, from what I see, especially the ancient sources. But either way, especially because like set literary works are long processes of writing, editing, thought, and so on and so forth. So that is very, very unlikely on the default. Unless you're like Jerome and you write your response to Helvidius in like one night, from what I've seen. So I think he actually does mention that in the preface, if I'm not mistaken. And then question 5 is kind of a catch-all for any other mitigating circumstances. So perhaps one can think of other potential mitigating circumstances and put those into separate questions. But otherwise, it's just a catch-all for anything else I might have missed. And so that is my formulation of the argument from silence in set criteria, in set questions, objective questions that one can ask of data. Now, to say all this again, let me hang on. Nope, spoilers. Say this again. This isn't me just because I'm focusing on this very precise kind of argument from silence. This doesn't mean I dismiss in principle, or at least fully, arguments from silence that just appeal to a mere lack of sources, for example. I don't per se dismiss that, but as I mentioned before, very precarious and borderline useless with respect to antiquity, because the vast majority of what we have from antiquity just does not survive today. Otherwise, though, it can work better with modern times with a plethora of documentation. And so I don't dismiss that argument in principle, but it's just much less useful, and so I don't want to spend much time defending it. Otherwise, though, the criteria that I establish here, that I mention here, can be modified and applied to another such kind of an argument. But in either way, though, I do share the same cautions as those like McGrew give for arguments from a mere lack in sources or mere lack of sources. It's very dangerous, very, very, very dangerous. So I'm not defending that, but that doesn't mean I'm denying the potential validity of such arguments. I'm not doing that. They just have a far higher burden of proof given the virtually infinite multiplication of factors that can affect the survival of sources, let alone whether someone would intend to write something down or not, or say a certain fact acontextually. That's the key thing. These are acontextual arguments, much more dangerous. Now, let's look at some examples of bad arguments from silence. And these are just 3 I've listed here, but I can think up of any number of more if you want. A very common one you hear from everyone from liberal, skeptical scholars, quote unquote, to liberal, skeptical YouTubers, bloggers, atheists, and all that stuff, is that the gospel authors would have named themselves in the text had they been eyewitnesses, but since they do not, the gospel authors were not eyewitnesses. And this is utterly silly because they do not demonstrate that that is a raw assumption that they would state that they're eyewitnesses in the text. I mean, I could grant that that may be more intuitive. I think that's more intuitive as a modern Westerner who is very used to being very particular and precise with my data. That's a key thing. But otherwise, that's just an assumption. They need to actually demonstrate that assumption that this is a universal truth thing. And we know for a fact that it's false. We have eyewitness historical documents that do not name themselves within the text, and yet their authors were known, whether it be Xenophon's Anabasis. I think even in his later work, he actually tried to attribute it to someone else, but his own authorship survives testimony. Likewise with Caesar's commentaries. And there can be various reasons for why an author may not mention themselves in the text. And the reasons for why those authors might have not mentioned themselves in the text were probably not the same reasons for why the gospel authors didn't mention themselves in the text. But that's irrelevant because that demonstrates concrete examples of ancient authors having reasons to not name themselves within a text. And God knows other reasons out there which we may not be privy to because we do not share the minds of the gospel authors. And nonetheless, there's numerous other means where they could have mentioned their eyewitness testimony, especially since the Gospels were they were written for specific communities or even an individual with respect to the Gospel of Luke. The testimony of who wrote it could have been carried on orally. It was just known in the community. Hey, Matthew came over one day. He gave us his Gospel. It was written by Matthew. There you go. And he didn't see a need to name himself in the text. Why? Don't know. Then again, it's his mind. He doesn't share our mind. He doesn't share our priorities necessarily. Likewise, the other gospel authors, except, well, arguably, Gospel of John does name himself the beloved disciple, although we can't put a name to that. I would say that such a reference would be kind of meaningless unless the community that first received it would know who the beloved disciple was. But either way. Whatchamacallit? Likewise, ancient texts could have tags attached to the book with the name written on it. So even if it's not necessarily mentioned in the text. So even if we didn't have the examples of Caesar and Xenophon, again, tons of ancient sources missing. And even if we had a comprehensive thing of ancient sources, there's nothing that actually psychologically stops an ancient author or even a modern author from just not naming themselves in the text because they are capable of attesting to their own authorship in person, orally, or by a tag attached to the work. Why not? There's no reason to say that could not be the case or that would not be the case. And so that's a very bad kind of argument from silence. It's propagated by YouTube skeptics and liberals and all that stuff. Not on the basis of good historical methodology, but because of their skepticism. And whereas they like to say that Christians have a vested interest in defending the authorship of the Gospels, I can grant that. Yeah, I can grant that. Doesn't mean that someone's not open to the evidence of the contrary. But likewise, just as well, they have a vested interest in the Gospels not being written by eyewitnesses because that vastly increases the chances that their entire worldview is wrong. So, tit for tat. Bad argument from silence. Relative silence of the Sabbath proves non-existent keeping by Gentile Christians during the NT era. Yeah, that's another one to explore. There you go. I haven't studied that one much by myself, but yeah, that's another potential. Thank you, my resident SDA friend. Another bad argument from silence. Ignatius of Antioch never mentions the Bishop of Rome in his letter to the Roman Church. Therefore, Rome did not have a monarchic bishop. Same problem there. No expectation has been proven from within the text that he would mention it, just as there's no expectation demonstrated that the gospel authors would name themselves within the body of the text. Likewise, there is no expectation established that Ignatius of Antioch would mention the Bishop of Rome in his letter to the Roman Church. That is an empty supposition, and it's unfortunate that a number of protopologists bring this argument up. But yeah, it doesn't prove anything. The mere lack of mention of such doesn't prove anything. As other Catholic apologists have rightly pointed out, he doesn't name or mention any deacons or elders either. So that must prove that Rome was just total anarchy, no ecclesial leadership at all, which is silly because we know for a fact from earlier documentation like First Clement that there was. Super late to the stream. How dare you? Another one, and this isn't an argument from silence, but it's an example where silence of historical testimony may just reflect an author's ignorance and not the non-existence of something. But we know that Augustine, he was unaware of the Council of Sardica, which is a big council. And yet other contemporary sources like Athanasius directly attest to it. So that's just an example of an author being ignorant of something which is otherwise demonstrably true. And I would argue that this is the same for gospel authors, that the mere lack of mention in the text, in the direct text of the gospels themselves, is overridden by the fact of historical testimony to their authorship. And then, of course, that's where the hyperskepticism comes in. Oh, but they could have been wrong. Oh, but they had an apologetic interest. Oh, they rely on this guy. They rely on this guy. Oh, this guy made a mistake over here. Yeah, basically skeptical coping. Likewise with Ignatius of Antioch, and there's so many other bad arguments from silence, but I hope these kind of demonstrate it. The flaw of the two main arguments from silence I proposed here is that they fail in the second question. Okay, even the second one, the second one actually even potentially fails in the first question. There hasn't been demonstrated that Ignatius of Antioch necessarily would know of the Bishop of Rome, because that's a very far away location. Okay, he's not personally privy to it. We don't have, in fact, he very likely did not visit Rome before. And so, yeah, that can actually be an explanation of his silence. Either way, though, these two main examples of bad arguments from silence, they fail primarily in the second question. They do not actually demonstrate from the context of the sources themselves why something ought to have been mentioned. Apart from just mere supposition. Oh, well, it would be mentioned. Why? Oh, it just would be. Why? No evidence given. That's why these arguments from silence fail. Now, on to criticisms and responses. There's two primary criticisms of the arguments from silence which I have found. The first one being, one, silence is absence of evidence, which doesn't mean evidence of absence. This is a fallacy of negative proof. So basically the good old Carl Sagan quip, absence of evidence, not evidence of absence, which I deny. And attack number two, there are countless possible reasons why an author may still be silent on an issue despite the silence meeting the criteria. That one's going to be interesting when I get to it. But now we'll look at the first criticism to start with. So I actually learned of... I learned that this author, David Hackett Fisher, he has a book, Historians' Fallacies, which is really, really good. Dr. Falk, in our interview, he mentioned him in his explanation of why he does not like the argument from silence. And basically David Hackett Fisher says that the argument from silence is at least as he defines it, it's a fallacy of negative proof. So I'll actually read one of his paragraphs. The fallacy of the negative proof is an attempt to sustain a factual proposition merely by negative evidence. It occurs whenever a historian declares that there is no evidence that X is the case and then proceeds to affirm or assume that not X is the case. He may have spent all the years of his youth in the antiquarian society, feverishly seeking the holy X and never finding it. He may have examined every relevant scrap of evidence in every remote repository without reward. He and every other reasoning being on the planet may know in their bones that not X is the case. But a simple statement that there is no evidence of X means precisely what it says. No evidence. The only correct empirical procedure is to find affirmative evidence of not X, which is often difficult, but never, in my experience, impossible. I definitely dispute that, especially with antiquity, but either way. Third, evidence must, he says it in another paragraph later on. Third, evidence must always be affirmative. So the first paragraph I actually don't dispute. It's actually totally true. Mere silence doesn't mean anything. This is where the main criticism comes in, though, which I want to challenge. Third, evidence must always be affirmative. Negative evidence is a contradiction in terms. It is no evidence at all. The non-existence of an object is established not by non-existent evidence, but by affirmative evidence of the fact that it did not or could not exist. as, for example, in a low coefficient of correlation in the case of a comparative analysis. Math moment. In the case of a journalist who did not, in fact, call upon a president, proof requires affirmative evidence from the journalist or the president, or evidence that the journalist was somewhere else at the time, or evidence that the president's time was entirely taken up with other things. If proof of this sort cannot be found, then the point cannot be proved, and a historian must candidly accept uncertainty. This is the rule of affirmation. So, the rule of affirmation. So, on where we agree, yes, he is right. Mere silence doesn't prove anything. Mere saying, because there is a lack of evidence for this, therefore X is not true, does not follow in the slightest. Can be countless reasons why a true thing may not be recorded, or the records thereof not preserved. However, the problem comes when he says that negative evidence is just not evidence at all, that there's a contradiction in terms. And thus his denial of the evidentiary power of all silence. And I believe this is misguided because, for the reasons established earlier, there are circumstances in which a claim does establish expectations of its appearance in certain contexts. And so, if we can establish such a context exists and there's no other mitigating factors, then the lack of a mention of a fact is evidentially significant. Yes, it's a lack of evidence. So in that technical sense, it's not evidence, but it is evidence in the higher order sense that the fact of the non-existence of a reference where it is expected is itself evidence. So actually, yes, negative evidence can be evidence because it can show you something by the fact that something which is expected is not present. That's where I dispute. That's where I respond to David Hackett Fisher. He ignores the possibility, at least as far as I'm aware, as far as I've read him, he ignores the possibility of claims establishing expectations and that such expectations can be falsified, or rather that we can find context where such is expected and that they can fail those expectations, and therefore that the claim itself is mitigated against evidentially. So that's how I'd respond to that criticism. Again, by the way, people, forgot to mention, post your questions for Q&A. Well, I didn't forget to mention actually, but post your questions for Q&A. I decided to just go all the way through and not stop for... Actually, I think I will stop for questions before the case studies. So post your questions, which I'll be getting to answer after this criticism section before we get to the main case studies, and also for the very end of the lesson as well. So get your questions posted. Supporters and super chats get priority. Anyway, let me bring back my windows. The second criticism is forwarded actually by the same paper, by John Lane. So he's the guy who actually proposed the argument from silence. He formulates the argument from silence from what's their names? What do I call them? Lango and Sengo, the guys with the unpronounceable names. He himself actually criticizes their claim to being able to establish a certain argument from silence. And so he says this on page 293, and it's an article in a journal, so that's why it's such a high page number. Lastly, it should be pointed out that the conclusive model, so proposed by Lango and Sengo, is not conclusive in spite of the contention of Lango and Sengo. Let us suppose that we have an instance of the argument from silence that meets the listed conditions, and moreover that we can be confident that it meets them. That argument would still not be conclusive because the author of D, the document, may not have been allowed to act in accord with his intentions, or his intentions may have been frustrated at some later date. In the first case, perhaps his patron did not permit him to include reference to E in his document. In the second case, perhaps reference to E was later removed by a censor. Now, this is certainly, I'll grant, this is certainly a true possibility or even probability in a number of circumstances. This can be shown that, hey, there may be reasonable mitigating circumstances, either which we do have evidence for or which we can't discount, which should cause us to at least be cautious with the argument from silence. However, the argument of silence in the rigorous form I have provided, and even in the one provided by Lang himself, establishes standards for discerning such a meaningful silence so as to render the non-reality of the claim at minimum, more probable than other circumstances seeking to explain the silence yet retain the idea as reality. So I can even grant that maybe we can, in some circumstances, we may need to drop moral certainty, but we can still establish this is much more probable than this. Non-reality is more probable than reality. It may well eventually come to the point that non-reality is the more parsimonious explanation of the data than some speculated chain of causes that render a silence somewhere where otherwise it should not be. And this is the key thing. This response very strongly risks falling into baseless skepticism. Just, oh, well, it could have been this, it could have been that. Even if you establish, hey, the author should have mentioned this fact had he known it, and if it was real, he would have known it. So if it was real, he would have known it. He definitely would have mentioned it in this situation. Nothing seems out of the ordinary in the text or in the circumstances in which it was composed. This is the author being honest. He's competent. There's no pressures around him to say otherwise. At minimum, no evidence of such. And we don't have any decent reason to suppose that. And perhaps there's even reason against thinking that. And so in light of that, all else being equal, we have a meaningful silence that proves the non-reality of something. And so merely positing, oh, this could be the case, this could be that case, means nothing. That's just hyperskepticism. It's baseless. Unless there is some concrete reality used behind that, it means nothing. It means nothing. Whether that concrete reality be positive evidence or such a meaningful absence of data where that thing does need to be considered. And so I thought I'd bring out a good quote from the book by Keith Winshuttle. I have it over there, called The Killing of History, which is basically a massive attack on like postmodernists and literary critics. And basically try to establish that no, there's good traditional historical method, should be upheld. It's good, it's meaningful. And he does this attack, gives this response in the context of hyperskeptics who try to deny inductive reasoning. So something that's not like logically A, B, therefore C. He says, quote, necessary truths are void of empirical meaning. By that, he means the claim that, oh, well, something could, in theory, be wrong. And to which he says, yeah, cool, so what? That's just a theory. So when any skeptic claims that a flame found tomorrow might not be hot like those of the past, or that the next baby born might not have circulating blood, he has no genuine reason for his doubt, only an empty necessary truth. Stove, another author, comments, so he's citing this guy, if I have, as Popper says I should not have, a positive degree of belief in some scientific theory, what can Popper urge against me? Why, nothing at all, in the end, except this, that despite all the actual or possible empirical evidence in its favor, the theory might be false. But this is nothing but a harmless necessary truth. And to take it as a reason for not believing in scientific theories is simply a frivolous species of irrationality. So that's how I'll respond. This can be very readily applied, at least to a certain hyperskeptical use of Lane's argument, which I argue he does approach. He does kind of approach a form of baseless skepticism. The mere necessary truth that something could be false, or that something could be, in the case of an argument from science, that there could be this mitigating circumstance, unless it's actually grounded in positive data, or at least in such an absence of data where that thing could be really brought up as a possibility. In the absence of that, there's no reason to grant that. And so it just becomes baseless speculation. And how much does that weigh versus the positive data that we do have, that there is an expectation something would be mentioned, the author is honest, is competent, there's nothing stopping him from saying this thing, and yet he doesn't say it. That's much more powerful. Much more powerful. So, any questions so far? Let me look through. I don't see any questions by supporters so far, either here or in the supporter questions channel. By the way, if you're a supporter, I do recommend go to the supporter question channel in the Discord so I can easily distinguish your questions. I do not see... I think there was one question. Okay, so nothing from supporters yet. Let me help. Is McGrew's paper open access? Don't think so. Don't think so. I've been able to read it though. So yeah, talk to me afterwards if you want. Let's see. Good question. Oh no, this guy's a supporter. I'm so sorry. You just became a supporter. I should have asked you first. Oh well, time difference shouldn't matter. What's the best way to apply this to iconodulia? Excellent question. And since you are a supporter, I'm going to definitely spend some extra meaningful time on this. So there's a number of ways where this can be mentioned, where this can be applied to iconodulia. So hypothetically, if there are texts in which the central liturgical practices of the church are being laid out and listed, one can argue that the absence of any mention of iconodulia is significant, because in Eastern theology in particular, not so much in Western theology. So if you're arguing against the Romanists and their conception of iconodulia, this might not mean as much. Because even in the Trad West, icons are nowhere near as big a role as the East. But if you're arguing against an Easterner who does affirm that icon veneration is a very central liturgical devotional practice of the apostolic faith, the absence of such in a text that is and this is just a hypothetical text. I'm not thinking of any real examples right now, but one where such practices are listed, the absence of iconodulia could be significant. So you got to investigate that. Likewise with icon theology, the theology underlying it, particularly brought out by John of Damascus, being that the incarnation sanctified all matter, sanctified all nature. Therefore, whereas it might not have been permissible before, it is now permissible for us to create images of Christ. And in fact, we should create images of Christ and venerate them because of the reality of the incarnation. Now, in texts that thoroughly deal with the incarnation, perhaps even, for example, Athanasius of Alexandria is on the incarnation of the Word, the absence of such an idea, which is allegedly, according to Eastern theology, a central component of the incarnation, of what it did, the absence of such an idea in a treatise or a detailed work in the incarnation could be significant. Not giving anything definite, but it could be significant, worth investigating. And perhaps even in particular, the most meaningful silences will come from when authors are directly treating images. And rather than show any hint of the theology where, like, well, images are permissible because of the incarnation, so it's okay to do this kind of veneration, but not this kind of worship. And instead of that, you see a total absence of such an incarnational theology, and they just speak against images simpliciter. Maybe they'll cross over from an argument from silence to just an outright contradiction, but either way, those are some areas in which it could be applied. There's many other circumstances. Basically, just look at the criteria I've laid out and that these authors have laid out. And by the way, I didn't have time to put in the full bibliography at the end of the slides. I'll list them in a comment below, the works I've cited, and maybe any other recommended sources if I think of them. Otherwise, though, that's how. Those are some ways to apply this to iconodulia. But again, even with this more rigorous form of the argument from silence, be careful. Be careful, because it does require a very particular kind of data, and enough of it at that. And so in many, many, many situations, in many sources, you're not going to be able to make this argument because there's just not enough data. In some, however, there is. And I'll be giving one such example soon. Ignatius is a decent argument from silence when used as a piece of evidence for the overall case. Yeah. In that scenario, I don't think it becomes evidence, but just a reflection of something which is otherwise proven by other sources, which I'd agree. There is proof in other sources. Not related to the lesson, but how old are you? I've recently discovered your channel and watched your intro videos, but don't look at those first intro videos. Those are cringe. I'm supposed to get rid of them. But I was wondering how you started to walk down the path you're on. Apologia/history. I'm 23 years old. 23. And basically, I think it's more or less all started from like a massive challenge with my faith. well, I kind of already had an interest in the faith, so I had an interest in studying like theology and Bible and that beforehand. But a massive intellectual challenge to my faith, particularly with respect to historicity, New Testament historicity, and that. And this wasn't just me going to like Barton Urban. I'd go to like the super niche guys who were making like the cutting edge arguments, you know, people who weren't famous like him. And because I dived head deep first into that, I very nearly apostatized until I learned to ignore the attempted air of neutrality they throw around themselves. Oh, look at me, I'm an unbeliever. I'm impartial. I'm not like an apologist who just defends what he believes. That's bull. I recognize that's bull because everyone has presuppositions. Everyone has apologetic interests for their worldview. But then I also started to reapply the same critical thinking against them. And when I did that, their case fell apart. And even more so over time as I studied good and proper historical methodology. So I decided after then I would study history and good methodology outside of apologetic context. Get a good positive basis of method and history first, and then engage apologetically. In fairness, I'd engage apologetically even then afterwards, and since the beginning of my channel, really. But otherwise, I always had distinct study and learning in historical method and history and good logical thinking in that outside of apologetic context. And when I've done that, it's really shown to me how humble we all have to be. So much more humble. Even many Christian apologists who try to give arguments which they think are quite decisive against other views. No, not quite. There's a lot of complexities. At minimum, what my study has shown is that the defeaters against the Christian faith, they just don't work because they're based on bad method, bad assumptions. And there's good reasons. To speak purely from an evidential point of view, there are good reasons to believe in the Christian faith. There are. I could even grant that maybe it's not absolutely certain, but there are good reasons to believe it. But then there are other reasons I would otherwise employ to demonstrate that yes, it should be believed. There's certainty behind it. But that comes into more distinct concepts of like certainty of faith and all that stuff. Either way, that's kind of how I got into this. I wanted to learn, wanted to be good at this stuff. But eventually, though, it just got into to be articulate in my faith and all that. But eventually, it's just become like a positive appreciation for history and historical study itself. I just love it. I absolutely love it. I think it's very useful. I very much resonate with the comments of many ancient historians who speak of the reasoning of why they do history is for moral and didactic purposes. So unlike today, many many historians today in particular, they just go into history because like, oh, look, they think their subject is cool or they're personally fascinated by it or they want to make a career out of it. But when you read the ancient historians, their concerns are fundamentally, I don't think universally, but they're very, very most often for moral instruction, teaching, all that jazz. Basically for good conduct in life. Learn from the mistakes of the past and learn from the good examples of the past. So that's a very common thing. I do really like that about history, and I have the same mindset, but also with the added priority of learning from the story that God has written in history, learning how God has guided history, and from the past saints. Good presentation so far. Very clear. Thank you very much. Sergio Mendoza. I spoke with you on Facebook once, like 2 months ago. I hope you're doing well. Waiting for a Spanish opera opening for one of your YouTube videos. Thanks, King. Thanks. Good to see. Oh, man. Good to see. Here we go. We have another supporter question from the supporter questions channel on Discord. So let me just post it here. Okay, here we go. He asks, how does this specific argument from silence apply to Augustine's attack on pagan images and the defense of the veneration of Eucharistic vessels? I would say that with the evidence from Augustine, it's not an argument from silence anymore. I think it's a very clear contradiction. So not only is he silent on the existence of and use of icons in Christian liturgical and devotional practice, that's a meaningful silence there, and I think that is a very meaningful silence given the discourse at play. But further, his comments go beyond that, and they go, I believe, into explicit rejection. Not that he has a concept of Christian icons and he rejects that, but rather the explicit argumentation he gives directly contradicts the priorities and concepts of iconodulia, Second Council of Nicaea. But I guess I'd say yes. Look, that's coupled with a silence of Christian imagery, but again, that itself is supplemented by positive argumentation. That's what I would say. When in a debate, it seems this possibility wouldn't work with everyone like Craig Trulia due to his massive amount of cope. You hear that, Craig? You're going to defend yourself. If you're watching right now, Craig, you're going to defend yourself against my man Herschel. I'm trying to see what you're trying to say. When in debate, so Athanasius said, as apply Augustine's argument against pagan images in defense of the veneration of Eucharist. When in a debate, it seems this possibility wouldn't work with everyone like Craig due to his massive amount of cope. Okay, so I guess you're saying like he'd try to cope his way around it. Hey, Craig, sorry, I'm being honest. Yeah, probably. probably. And I expect Craig to say the same thing about me, that I cope around things. Difference is I'm right and he's wrong. But no, that's when you say work, that seems like rhetorically he could find ways around it. But I think, look, logically, just by pure standards of evidence and argumentation, it 100% works, 100%. It's combined with a positive argument as well that he positively contradicts. He positively contradicts the idea that Christians pray through vessels, through images to God. That's an explicit contradiction of iconodulia, even if he isn't thinking of Christian images. And that's the case because he could not have such a conception because, according to him, that very thing could not exist. There could not be such a thing as Christian images through which you pray, because he precludes that very possibility. So to expect that he mentions Christian images specifically is ridiculous, because that's the very thing he's denying, that Christians do that. And that's something I'm going to be mentioning in my next lecture, by the way, which is going to be about this very topic. But Augustine was a Manichaean Gnostic, so why would you appeal to Ken Wilson moment. All right. That's enough questions for now. Throw in more questions. I probably went a little bit too long with this, but throw in more questions. I should have taken this off while I was doing that. Oh, well. Throw in more questions for the Q&A because now we're going to get to the end. We're going to do the final bit. Examples of meaningful silence. So here's where the rubber meets the road. Here's where I show my criteria, my arguments from silence, and how it can very well work. So here we have case study number 1. An outsider from a town investigates whether a town parade occurred on a certain date. So that's the historical assertion. A town parade occurred on this date. That's the assertion. Now, a town local called Gary, it is that the person finds that a town local called Gary, he keeps a diary of all significant events in the town and even many minor happenings. The diary is fully intact, and Gary attests to being in town on the date in question, and he does not record any parade happening. Now, I forgot to add to that. He does record other things which are of lesser significance, like, I don't know, like a fight that happened on a street corner or something. But either way, he was in town. His diary has the purpose of recording major events in the town, no discrimination. And yet, so we would expect that if a parade happened at this date, he would have recorded it, but he doesn't. Additionally, so that alone would be good positive evidence against a parade happening at this date. Additionally, the local council, this is to make an even stronger silence, because you can compound the silence of sources when there's multiple sources with a contextual silence. Additionally, the local council keeps a bulletin with all major events listed, especially those, or I should say, including those hosted by the government, and this parade was supposedly hosted by the government. They too do not list a parade on that date. So, this is extremely strong, conclusive silence that there was not a parade on the date specified. And thus, the person from outside of town packs up their bags and draws their conclusions. So this is just a hypothetical example I came up with. One hypothetical, which I believe is a ideal case of silence, where you can really strongly deduce, or maybe not deduce strictly, but conclusively infer that there is silence, that something did not happen. Because not just one, but two sources which are demonstrably privy to this information and would have mentioned it in their sources, do not mention it. That's an example of very meaningful silence. Case study number 2. This is the real example now that I'm going to appeal to. And this is going to be the spicy one. Because this is the same argument from silence I use in my presentation on First Clement, and which I have brought up on other times where such was relevant. But now I'm going to be giving it in much more precise terms, using my specific criteria and questions. Case study number 2. It is claimed by a number of Romanists and Easterners that, and some Protestants, mainly like Anglo-Catholics, if you can even call them Protestant, that the threefold hierarchy was an apostolic institution. So, the 3 tiers of office of deacon, presbyter, bishop, and they are all distinct. They are distinct 3 offices that were established by the apostles themselves. However, we have in our possession a letter from the 1st century Roman Church, contemporaneous with the apostles, circa AD 70 or pre-70. That's what I argue, an early date for the letter. And so this is smack bang in the time of when the apostles lived, after Peter and Paul were martyred, but only a few years after they were martyred. And so the leaders behind the letter, the elders of the Roman Church, they certainly had contact with Peter and Paul. And chapter 42 says the following: the apostles received the gospel for us from the Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus, the Christ, was sent forth from God. So then, Christ is from God, and the apostles are from Christ. Both, therefore, came of the will of God in good order. Now, this is the context, not just the context of this passage, but of the whole letter, doing things according to the order God has established. And in this part of the letter, he goes on to establishing the ecclesial order that God has established and why one must submit to it. So the threefold hierarchy question is quite relevant, but it gets even more relevant with what's said after this. Having therefore received their orders and being fully assured by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ and full of faith in the word of God, they went forth with the firm assurance that the Holy Spirit gives, preaching the good news that the kingdom of God was about to come. So preaching both in the country and in the towns, they appointed their first fruits when they had tested them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons for the future believers. And this was no new thing they did, for indeed something had been written about bishops and deacons many years ago. For somewhere thus says the scripture, I will appoint their bishops in righteousness and their deacons in faith. So notice this, directly relevant. Actually, hang on, I'll leave that to the questions. So let's run this data through the criteria. Q1, would the author, or in this case authors, I do believe First Clement was written by multiple, have known about X? Answer, so would they have known about the apostolic establishment of the 3-tier hierarchy had it been true? The answer, a resounding yes. The letter was composed collectively by the Church of Rome, see the prologue of the letter, as well as the ubiquitous use of we throughout the text. And actually, I'll add as well, even the witness of Irenaeus, who distinguishes between how the letter was sent by the Church of Rome in the time of Clement. So a distinction between the individual Clement and the Church of Rome. But nonetheless, this collective would have included Clement, a leader of the Roman Church at the time. And given the dating of the letter, at minimum 1890s, but the best evidence suggests the 70s, the leaders are well within living memory of the apostles and likely conversed with Peter and Paul, who certainly visited Rome according to historical testimony, see the witness of Papias, of Irenaeus, as well as the knowledge of their martyrdoms mentioned in chapter 5 of 1 Clement. Overall, the authors had direct access to the apostolic preaching and were certainly, given the time they live in, were either directly appointed by the apostles or by the immediately following generation of leaders, providing among the best attestation for apostolic ecclesial policy we could ask for, at least for that of Peter and Paul. So I want to be precise here, at least for Peter and Paul. Question 2. Is there any instance in the author's literary output wherein a mention of X, so that is all three tiers of the holy orders, is expected? And then why is it expected? To which I say, yes, chiefly in chapter 42, as we just read, wherein the establishment of the church government by the apostles is summarized, including the purpose of such and what offices were constituted for that end. And when it does so, it simply names bishops and deacons. And those bishops elsewhere, I'll say, are called presbyters, but I'll ignore that for now. For there to have been a third integral holy order, in this case, a distinct class of presbyters / priests, distinct from bishops, for there to have been a third integral holy order that was established and yet left unmentioned is utterly inexplicable, apart from a lack of knowledge of such, especially since the lesser role, authority rise of deacon is mentioned. So it's actually extremely simple. This here is establishing a direct expectation of the data, because the text in question is answering the very question that we are asking. The question we are asking is, did the apostles establish 3 holy orders? And here we have in the text a direct addressing of what offices the apostles established. What did they establish for the leadership, for the government of the church? And government, widely speaking. So not just the top-down leaders, but also the stewards who make things happen, like the deacons. And the fact that he mentions deacons shows that. This is a general overall picture of what the church order looks like by the apostles. He is directly answering the question we are asking. And when he gives an answer, he does not include a third holy order in between deacon and bishop, which is asserted by at least certain Romanists and Easterners, because I know not all of them do assert that it was apostolically established. Although I do argue, I do argue that that such is definitely necessary for their ecclesiology. But either way. So yes, we do have a very explicit expectation of such, and this is further validated because even the sub criteria is here affirmed. Other ideas, is another idea or ideas of the same kind as the one in question proposed? To which I say yes. It directly mentions that overseers and deacons were established by the apostles. The same kind of idea as in a holy order as the distinct third class of presbyter priest, distinct from bishop. And so the fact that the author is directly answering the question which we are asking, and it lists the equivalent ideas of overseers and deacons, one authoritatively above and one authoritatively below the third class in question, and yet it doesn't mention that third class, even though it is directly establishing what the apostles established for the fundamental order and government of the church. That is crazy. That is significant. Question 3, is the author honest? The assumption is yes, there is no reason to doubt the honesty of the authors of First Clement. Additionally, they do have as their aim the restoration of peace and order in the church at Corinth, according to divine truth. You can see that in the preface and in many other chapters following God's ordained order. And so they have an interest in honestly conveying what that order looks like. And indeed, we even see from a preserved fragment of a 2nd century letter by Bishop Dionysius of Corinth, he actually directly thanks the Roman Church for their intervention in the crisis those times ago. So he himself attests, presumably through the memory of his community, because only a century ago, not technically speaking too long, he attests that their help was, real and it was helpful. Now, question 4, is the author competent? Yes, the letter is very well written. It is an extensive piece of literature that weaves together many themes and texts into a single flow. There's no evidence of incompetence or inattentiveness. And even with the possibility, even if that was a possibility, the very simple, non-nuanced reality of a third holy order in a hierarchy, of which the authors themselves were a part of, that just could not be missed. I will categorically say they could not miss that. They can't. They just can't. Whoopsie daisies. I forgot to delete that prior. Okay, so question 3 and 4. Question 5, are there any other mitigating factors, such as forgetfulness? There are none. The text is well composed, flows logically, including chapter 42. There's no other mitigating circumstances. So, conclusion. Given that the authors of First Clement were in a position to know what ecclesial structure the apostles, at least Peter and Paul, established, being contemporaneous with them, and likely conversant with them, and given that they would have mentioned such in the discourse of chapter 42, we can conclude with high certainty, I'll even straight up say moral certainty, that the authors of First Clement are unaware of a 3-tier hierarchy in the church, and that their ignorance of such indicates the non-apostolicity of the three-tier hierarchy, at least with respect to Peter and Paul. Now, so that's my argument from this real positive case, which I believe is one of the best examples I could have used to establish my kind of argument from silence. Now, notice why my argument from silence surpasses the many other poor attempts at such. It doesn't just appeal to the mere silence in First Clement, i.e., if they knew of the three-tier hierarchy, they would have mentioned it. So, acontextual, without any reference to any context, or they would have mentioned it. So, there is absolutely no reason to grant that expectation unless such is demonstrated from within the text itself, and indeed it is in chapter 42. Number 2. The context appealed to is not vague in such a way where there could be good reasons, whether intentionally on the author's part or unintentionally, for the idea not being mentioned. So, for example, a general discussion of the nature of the church, which may not include all the details, one could reasonably suspect that maybe the author won't mention all these details. But, so here's the thing, the context which I'm appealing to is not just a general similarity of context, but is squarely about the issue which is in question. In this case, it is directly answering the question of what offices the apostles established, the very question in contention. And since the answer lacks a mention of a third office, we can thus conclude that the authors did not have such in mind. Conclusion. I forgot to completely finish these slides, but I think this is more or less all I need to say. Conclusion from the whole presentation. The argument from silence, when rightly understood and employed with proper criteria, is a valid and useful tool for historians when the data allows for such to be made. That's the key thing. You can't just shoehorn this everywhere. It depends on the data itself, like all historical method does. Second, it is easy to abuse this argument, so anyone employing it, and this is talking about the argument in silence in general, not just my specific form, it's very easy to abuse. Well, actually, even the last point does show that the argument in silence is in principle valid. I'd say even the vaguer forms of a mere lack of sources, because there could be circumstances in which claims could become questionable with a mere lack of sources, but that's another thing. That's for another day. Now, it is easy to abuse the argument from silence, so anyone employing it must constantly keep their expectations in check with solid criteria like those listed before. I cannot stress that enough. I cannot stress enough how necessary it is for people to constantly be checking their analysis against solid criteria. Whether it's mine, whether it's other criteria, I believe mine, and which is drawn from the other sources mentioned before, are the best criteria. You should definitely go with them. Keep checking your arguments, your observations against the criteria, and be honest about it, okay? Don't try to squeeze out a silence where there is actually some more uncertainty, all right? And so that's my conclusion for this whole presentation. I have defined the argument from silence, the best form of the argument from silence, and I have defended it presuppositionally and against various two key criticisms which I have found. There are other potential criticisms out there, although I've found them mostly to be within certain contexts. So one I found, for example, that an argument from silence in patristic sources doesn't work because the early church was very, very, very conservative. They did not tolerate, there was outcry even about the smallest of changes. So that's a context, that's an argument for a certain context that can be dealt with. But now, with all that said, I hope you guys all saw value in this presentation. I hope you all learned a thing or two. I hope I was clear. And again, supporters, check out Subscribestar. Shortly after this, I'll be uploading my full notes. And I'll likewise be adding in a pinned comment below the bibliography because I didn't have time to make it today. Before this, that is. Anyway, questions. Throw in your questions for Q&A, people. In fact, while you guys are doing that, I'll give you a few minutes. Let me just go to the bathroom very quickly because I really do need to. Okay. What do we got? Okay. Don't worry, we'll just slap some Newman on it. Based. All right. Supporter question first by Herschel, my latest supporter, absolute legend. People follow the example of the boy Herschel himself, become a supporter on Subscribestar. We are only, let me check. It decides to load. We are only 11 supporters away from the 30 supporter mark, people, and we have the end till the end of March, till the end of February, rather, to make that happen. Uphill battle, but please, people, I believe this can be done. Uphill battle, but if I can reach 30 supporters by March, that would be freaking awesome. Absolutely legendary. Anyway, irrelevant, but what are some good sources against Mariology? So there is James White's Mary and Other Redeemer. It does give you a good grounding for basic arguments, although the discussion has definitely moved beyond there. So, oopsie daisies. 1 second. Sorry, mate. Okay, so anyway, James White's Mary and Other Redeemer, that has some decent arguments. It can get you started, but again, not your end. Various content by various Protestant apologists. So the guys over at Triablog, TRIABLOGUE, that their blog, they have a lot of material on Mariology and the various Marian dogmas. Likewise, Turretin Fan, both his blog and his YouTube. What else? What about specific books? I'm trying to think. I'm sure there are. I'm sure there's other books. Not totally certain. I mean, I guess the Eastern Orthodox deny the Roman dogma of the Immaculate Conception, so they probably have some materials out there. So yeah, not a whole ton of stuff. I've done some stuff. There was a certain argument, pop level argument, which the best Roman apologists they don't use it today, but otherwise it's still popular, where the Greek participle use of Mary in the when Gabriel met her, kacharitomene, which means favored one, graced one, whatever. They argue that, because it's a perfect participle, it refers to a completed action from the past, therefore Mary was immaculately conceived. One of my first videos in the channel is against that idea. So scroll down to the bottom of my channel, or go to the relevant playlist and you'll find it. I've done other material on Marian dogmas and that, so I guess you can find those here and there. I did a debate with Craig Trulia on the sinlessness of Mary, which is very interesting. Lots of sources brought up in that, so that's a useful watch. Yeah, not much else other than that. Best thing I can highly recommend is just you read the primary sources yourselves, measure them up against what Romanists and Easterners claim they're saying. That's all I can say. Okay, any supporter questions? Nope, don't see them. Okay. Could your criteria be used against infant baptism from texts like the Didache or Justin Martyr? Yeah, I mean, it could be applied to anything. I mean, the whole point of how I structure as questions, so you can filter any data through the questions. So the real question is whether the data will give an affirmative to most or all of the questions. Not every question necessarily needs to be an affirmative, I don't think. As I mentioned, for example, an author does not necessarily have to be totally competent to be a good witness of silence. It depends on the nature of their weaknesses. Likewise with criteria 2B on having another positive idea. Otherwise, though, yeah, all data can be sifted through. It's just a question of whether it says yes. So can it successfully go through my criteria and establish a meaningful silence? I don't know. I haven't looked at that. You can do that yourself if you want. But yeah, this is something I do eventually. I want to casually start working on my own book of historical methodology, something that's clear, to the point, but is actually otherwise drawing from the valuable insights of scholarship, particularly old school scholarship, which gets to the point and really gets deep into the matters and doesn't like waffle on like endless literary reviews by modern authors and that. I want to make my own book on historical method, maybe even a series if it's like detailed enough, you know. I want to go into as deep as I can on presuppositions, but maybe have like a section that's like most simple, but then section that goes even deeper and deeper and deeper. That would be super cool. I want to make it. What would it call? Is a Latin word methodicus? Methodicus. Oh no, that's an adjective. Methodical. What about methodus? Yeah, that's it. It would be deus. What would it be? It would be de methodico historical, I think, on historical method. De methodic. No, de metodo historical. That would be it. Unless you self-publish, they'll shoot down any Latin title. Yeah, I'll self-publish, stuff them. I actually intend to make my own publishing house one day, tied in with my idea for a pan-Protestant organization. Either way. Yes, my question is, why are you based? Oh, man, it's partially genetics, partially my Protestantism, my Anglicanism. That's just why. For real though, I'm just grounded. I don't want to get into the academic snobbery attitude. You know, I want to be a real guy. I'm doing learning for the sake of regular people, and so that I can actually translate. So what is learned can actually be translated and it's meaningful, and it's not just highbrow, uber complicated language and just sophistry. That's why I'm based, because I care about the groundedness. People, if you were to meet me in real life and you didn't know I was a YouTube channel, you'd think I'm just some random esche from Western Sydney. It's because I literally just walk down half the time with my cross necklace, a tank top, even a little side bum bag. Go to the pub, go to the takeaway joint. You wouldn't think that I do what I do, just meeting me in real life. That's how I want to keep it. I want to have the best. Because I don't believe in dichotomies like that. I can be both the epic mega brain intellectual, but also the down to earth real dude. You know, that's why I'm based. Does this apply to apostolic succession at all? It would, if you can establish a text where Romanist and Eastern apostolic succession should be mentioned, but it's not. And I believe that is the case with, for example, Irenaeus against heresies. Although that argument needs a little bit more. That example needs a little bit more argument to make. Would love to see a Protestant answers. Yeah, the idea for the name I've got so far is the Catholic Reformation. So nice and all-encompassing, trying to reclaim the title of Catholic, you know. But yeah, so let me see. Which Catholic doctrine do you feel this method debunks the most? I mean, look, I haven't applied this to like a whole ton of stuff yet. A good rigorous argument from silence. I've applied less rigorous arguments from silence, although still with the general, I still went with it along with the criteria of Gilbert Garrigan. So in my past content, if you've noticed, I have cited the same citations from Garrigan before and used that as criteria. And I think it can work, but I wasn't as detailed as I otherwise could be and should be. And so I think some of the silence arguments I've made in the past do work. I've made the same argument from silence I did with the first Clement thing here. Some other ones, though, may not work. So yeah, it depends. But I do think if someone does affirm, and if the Roman Church does affirm that the three-tier hierarchy is an apostolic institution, and if the East does affirm that, then I think my argument from the example of First Clement, and also from other documents, the same thing I believe can be shown in documents like the Didache and with Paul's letter to Timothy, first letter to Timothy, potentially others as well. 3 witnesses in the first century, the same conclusive silence can be shown, I believe. And so I think that alone can very definitively prove the non-apostolicity of the three-tier hierarchy. Needs to be more pop sounding. Nah, no way. No way. We need to get away from pop. We need to get away from the idea that we need to just appease to the pops where they are, you know? No. We need to elevate the pops. And so that does mean, of course, making things understandable and all that, and even having some entry-level stuff. But otherwise, the intention, bringing them up to big brainness. Dear Catholics, asking for evidence is not making an argument from silence. That's true. No, that's true. 100%. 100%. Rightio, mate. Rightio. All right. I don't see any more questions, and I think that's about the end of it. And that, yeah, so I guess that's been my presentation, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for coming on to this stream, for listening to this lesson, both people who are watching live now and people who are watching in the future. I'll do all the stuff I've said to do right after this. So people who are Subscribestar supporters, head over to Subscribestar in a few minutes, maybe 10 or so minutes. I'll have the document up there, my full notes. Likewise, I'll have the bibliography in the channel in the comments. But yeah, otherwise, thank you so much. I hope you guys all learned from this thing. And again, this is the return of regular lesson streams. So these are going to be happening every fortnight, unless there's an extraneous circumstance where I have to skip one. Otherwise, I'm committed to doing these every single fortnight, different topic every time. But yeah, whatchamacallit? What else should I plug? Next one. So in 2 weeks from now, the next one will be on a certain interpretive issue regarding the church fathers and icons. So now to venerate, how dare you? How dare you? Good work, Fortnite. Oh, shut up, you dumb Zoomer. Not everything's about the game. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Hope you all learned a thing or two. Become a supporter on Subscribestar. Check out the tier benefits. They are really cool. Whereas these lesson streams are basically all at my own discretion. If you become a supporter at two of the highest tiers, at one of the two highest tiers, you can engage in free tutoring hours with me right now. Or if you wait till March, I will be launching tutoring services for the public, likely around $25 a month. I'm still saying the best price, but I'm likely going to be that. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely day or evening. God bless.